So, politics and games. As a subject, the combination of politics and video games is not something I go out of my way to try and focus on. Some might say otherwise, and I certainly have a number of videos on the topic, but really the main focus is just video games and the subsequent industry landscape. However, over the past few months especially, it has become quite clear that there is a growing focus in contemporary political America on the video game industry, and as a result, it's certainly worth discussion. Now, I do not want to focus on individual instances of games themselves containing political themes. That is certainly a very real occurrence. It happens all the time, but it's not the topic for today. Instead, I want to frame the discussion around a growing presence of political agendas, policies, or references within the broader market at large, and make the case that it is a decidedly negative thing. Also, this position of ambivalence towards political systems burrowing their way into the games industry is not going to be framed around partisan lines, rather around the sad truth that politics in modern day America, regardless of how you examine it, is a complicated, often detrimental thing that struggles to fulfill even the simplest and most reasonable of goals. The obvious place to start is governmental regulation of in-game monetization. This is a two-pronged operation aimed at not only loot boxes, which are beyond any verbal contortion obviously a gambling mechanism, but also at pay-to-win microtransactions with the vague clarification on what specific parties will be responsible for interpreting, based on loose definitions, what games actually qualify as containing pay-to-win systems. I would go into the specifics of the recently proposed bill, but I've already done that in a previous video, so I'll link that in the description down below for anyone interested. On a personal note, I'm of the mindset that governmental regulation is a bull in a china shop. There are often horrific and unintended consequences to the sledgehammer tactics of United States federal regulation. But even so, despite my well-vocalized skepticism, it appears that it may be the only way forward. Most recently in the proceedings, to determine how the legislation may proceed, there was a hearing involving representatives from EA. In said hearing, Hopkins, an EA lawyer, did some of the most flagrant verbal contortions I have ever seen and arrived on the term surprise mechanics to try and distance loot boxes from the idea of gambling. They go so far as to even assert that loot boxes are a fun and ethical creation that is akin to something like a Kinder Egg. Obviously, this is corporate legal snake speak and a mere deflection to try and reorganize terms in a way that conjures up less damaging imagery. What sounds better, surprise mechanics or underage gambling? It's not really a question as to why they would do it, but more how far will they go? But even as universally despised as EA is, this is less about them as a company and more about the snowball of government intervention. What we have now, which is a somewhat concentrated push to regulate certain damaging practices within the industry, is just a first step. And I cannot speak of future events with any degree of certainty, but once the focus has pivoted and the sights have been aligned, it is a difficult thing to picture, at least for me, a scenario in which Washington politicians somehow manage to craft a single piece of pinpoint accurate legislation that solves the issue they intend for it to solve without lobbing a stink bomb into like 15 other areas. Regardless of what the future holds, this is just the first example. In a vacuum, it might be less notable, seeing as this isn't the first time that the government has set its sights on video games. A notable previous example would be the instance in which Mortal Kombat was brought before Congress because of its overly dramatic representations of violence and gore. That resulted in the ESRB, which has certainly had some degree of impact on the industry, but it is not something as severe as reclassification or an outright ban of income sources that comprise huge sections of revenue for multi-billion-dollar corporations. Right alongside the slowly grinding gears of regulation, however, is a growing privatized focus on selective censorship. Now, for this topic, it's a bit harder to draw a direct connection between an aversion to nudity by, for example, Sony executives and a specific political theme, but the idea of censorship, especially regarding creative vision, is something often inextricably linked with political bias. And yet again, by itself, this might not be something that indicates a broader political focus from outside sources, but when positioned alongside other signals, it starts to form a much more telling picture. Next on our list of factors to consider is a recent position taken by Democratic nominee candidate Bernie Sanders, running for the presidency. Now, I want to be clear here, this is not to disparage Bernie Sanders in any way, rather to outline a singular truth about American politics, which is that it largely operates around voting demographics and election or re-election. In a recent tweet, Bernie Sanders expressed that the gaming industry racked up an impressive volume of revenue last year, which is true, and that the workers responsible deserve collective bargaining as part of a union. Here's the issue. While not a direct contradiction, this is a different tactic than his positions during 2012, in which he very pointedly insinuates that video games and violent media desensitizes viewers and helps contribute to real-world violence. There is an obvious reason for this. During 2012, that was an effective strategy, as outlined by some analyst behind a desk in the back corner of an office in Washington, D.C. It was an effective strategy to garner voter support. Now, during 2019, video games are again in the fleeting spotlight, but this time because of a growing concern over crunch time and developer working conditions. The most effective tactic, by his campaign's perception, to bolster support for his presidential bid is to speak in favor of developer unions. This is just one in a long line of instances where politicians slot issues or topics into their rhetoric like a game of Connect 4 or something like that. When an extremely tragic and violent event occurred in the past, President Donald Trump did not hesitate to publicly condemn video game violence and glorification. I cannot speak to his exact or specific motivations, but as with Bernie Sanders, we can see a position wherein video games are simply slotted into their ever-continuing chain of talking points to sway public opinion. This is, after all, most of what our modern-day politicians do and care about, swaying or how to sway public opinion and perception. Now, if I had to speculate, I would say that for Bernie Sanders, a Democratic prospective nominee, unions have historically been a massive contributing party when it comes to campaign financing, especially for Democratic candidates. Since video game developers are a perfect entry point, he can garner voter support as well as donor support by making this a current issue. And in reality, this has far less to do with the actual health of the industry and far more to do with the struggle for power in a divided country. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Donald Trump, whose condemnation of video games could be speculated as an attempt to shift the focus away from Second Amendment controversy, and would certainly align with the preferences of the NRA, historically a massive contributing party to Republican candidates, and Donald Trump is the seated Republican president who is about to go up for re-election. As with Bernie Sanders, in one small move, Donald Trump can garner voter and donor support, rallying around his core platform positions. My effort is not to paint either side as right or wrong, since the truth of the matter is that there is an abundance of data to disprove any direct link between violent video games and violent behavior. My point is to show that on either side of the same exact coin are two distinctly different parties that have focused a spotlight on the video games industry for different reasons that both tie back into motivations that have absolutely nothing to do with the health of the industry. Governmental involvement at this point is likely an eventual inevitability, with lawsuits being opened up against Bethesda over Fallout 76, and actually they're made illegal in a lot of different states because of the click-through terms and service conditions, so only in California can a class action suit even progress. That's another reason why it's even happening. But moving on, the controversy of loot boxes and pay-to-win microtransactions and widespread industry fatigue as a result of poor working conditions. Meanwhile, on a side note, you have executives like Take-Two Interactive's Strauss Zelnick claiming that the average salary in the games industry is $100,000. Mr. Zelnick is citing figures from a 2017 Entertainment Software Association report, or ESA, and he himself is the chair of the Entertainment Software Association board. The ESA is a lobbying group tasked with pursuing the interests of their corporate, dues-paying members, and when he cites this figure, he in fact overestimates based off of an extrapolation formed from U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis documents that pertained to supplements in 2013, which were then added to a 2014 salary survey, which encompassed not just game development, but publishing. Setting aside the probability of a discrepancy between actual wages and who in particular was surveyed, the biggest issue is the average. An average is the sum divided by the count. So as an easy example, this is a very extreme example though, 9 developers making nothing per year and 1 publishing executive making $1 million per year means that the average salary for the individuals is $100,000 per year. Though in fact, it means absolutely nothing when trying to use it as a baseline for economic health and wage viability. Furthermore, the 2014 survey also heavily emphasizes and prioritizes lead programmers, project leads, and technical directors, which is an obvious point of interest seeing as the teams beneath these leadership figures are far larger and far more numerous, and they are paid far less. But Strauss Zelnick does not care, because he can manipulate the data from his own organization to enforce his desired perspective, thus doubling down on a position that is helping to cause the impending crackdown of brutal government regulation. As it stands, there is a rapidly evolving fusion between video games and politics. On one front is the regulation of monetization practices. On another, it is unionization. On still another, it is the shifting standards of censorship. And across the board, these motivations have less to do with the health of the industry or the relative quality of the games themselves, and much more to do with personal interest, political growth, or profit. As I stated at the beginning, this is less to do with the individual political themes in any one given video game and more to do with an industry that has rapidly evolved to a point where radical change is on the horizon as a direct result of politics, and where that change will carry us. I really could not say exactly where with any real certainty, but it is clear that there will be tangible effects in the near future. That's it for today, though. If you want to support the channel, check out the links down below. We have merchandise, various memberships, and some other stuff too, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.